If everyone can take a chance to turn their phone to silent or something.
That was my phone.
all of their no, mine was beeping.
Oh, okay.
And also there's a sign-in sheet that's being passed around, so please keep your eye out for that one as well. Okay, so welcome to the Bunche Center this afternoon. This afternoon we're having a panel discussion with Mignon Moore, who is the author of Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women. So what we're having is an authors meets critics panel discussion. So this is an opportunity for other scholars and professors in the field to kind of respond to Mignon's book so that we can have a deeper discussion of it and what it means, not only for scholarship, but also for policies and our own lives and identities. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers. We're going to listen to them speak, and then we're going to have time for everyone to speak. So I hope that you guys have at least read the introduction, maybe, or a blog about it. And then we're going to have a chance to speak with the scholars more personally. There's going to be a little bit of a reception, and then that's going to be that. Okay. So, and you guys are sitting in order that I have you. Okay.
So we did that.
So our professors today are Aisha Finch, Jane Ward, Ange Marie, and Mignon Moore. Okay, so Aisha Finch is currently an assistant professor of women's studies and Afro-American studies at UCLA. Her areas of research and teaching include transnational black feminism, gender ideologies in the African diaspora, comparative slavery, and political and intellectual movements in the Black Atlantic diaspora. She's currently working on a book manuscript exploring the resistance movements, political cultures, and gender ideologies of enslaved rural Cubans during the mid-19th century. Jane Ward is an associate professor of women's studies at the University of California, Riverside. She's the author of Respectably Queer, published by Vanderbilt University Press in 2008, as well as several articles on queer politics, transgender relationships, the social construction of heterosexuality, and most recently, queer motherhood. She teaches courses in feminist and queer studies and is the founder of LA Gender Queer Parenting, a baker of pies, and the author of the blog Feminist Pigs. We should have asked you to bring a pie. Ange Marie Hancock is Associate Professor of Political Science and Gender Studies in the Department of Political Science at USC Dana and David Dornsife College. She joined USC in 2008 after 5 years as an Assistant Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Yale University. Professor Hancock currently serves as the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration in the Dornsife College and is one of the inaugural Dornsife College Faculty Fellows. She's globally recognized scholar of the study of intersectionality, the study of the intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality politics, and their impact on public policy. Her current book, Solidarity Politics for Millennials, A Guide to Ending the Oppression Olympics, was published in August 2011, and it uses popular culture and recent survey data to analyze the contemporary challenges of immigration and same-sex marriage, and contends that the development of deep political solidarity is necessary to overcome persistent political challenges in U.S. politics. So Professor Mignon Moore is Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA, and she's also an Afro-American Studies professor. Her research examines within-group variation in processes and outcomes among disadvantaged groups. Moore's ongoing research provides an in-depth examination of the relationships African-American lesbians and gay men have with their racial and religious communities, and the features of LGBT protests that take place in black spaces between gay and heterosexual blacks. These relationships are not a tale of consensus and unity, and Moore shows how issues like same-sex marriage and gay and lesbian parenting play out for individuals struggling for a full acceptance within the racial group. Moore recently began an NIH-funded study to assess the physical and mental health outcomes that might be related to sexual identity, to support community institutions and regular sources of medical care for lesbian and gay elders in New York and Los Angeles. Okay, so this book, Invisible Families, is an intervention within LGBT studies, African American studies, and family studies. And these areas often overlook the relationship between homosexual identity, race identity, and family formation. So in this book, she goes through the process of talking about how people come into their homosexual identity, how people realize that they're gay, how they choose to present themselves as gay people within a spectrum of, normative gender representation versus non-normative. She also goes and talks about how people become lesbian parents. So you have lesbians who become parents because they're partnered with another lesbian person, but you also have, or not parents, but mothers. You also have mothers who are already, or women who are already mothers, and then they become lesbian, and they come out, and the process that has with, not only with their children, but within their extended family. She also talks about what it means to be a Black woman who is a lesbian and a mother. She talks about class. She talks about level of education and the impact that all of these things have on the way that the family works and forms. And she also talks about this within the context of the Black community, what this means for respectability and acceptability within the community, within the church, how people are accepted by other areas of community life. For example, do you have people that you can depend on to help with childcare and things like that? So I'm getting a little nervous, so I'm going to stop now and let the panelists speak. So if we can welcome everyone here and.
Okay. So I will actually just start off by saying I was paying a ticket yesterday at the local courthouses. The less said about that, the better. But and I had the book with me, and so the clerk said to me, she said, "Oh, what are you reading?" So I told her, and she was like, "Oh." So I said in my head, I said, "Oh, here we go." So she just kind of had, the kind of protracted silence, and so I was like, okay, let's get on with the business of my ticket. And a couple of minutes later, it was almost as if she had been thinking about it. She was like, "That's really interesting." She was like, "That's really fascinating. What is that book called?" And I said, well, it's called Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women. So I just begin with that to just call attention to the critical work that your book has already been doing, and I believe is going to continue to do in the public sphere in ways that you probably would not even have imagined. So I'm really honored to be just a part of this panel, and just to be thinking about this work and to be in conversation with you and with all of you. So so I'm just going to offer a couple of preliminary remarks that will kind of frame and situate the way that I was reading Mignon's argument, really within a deeper historical context of thinking about the Black family, and then kind of think in particular about some of the larger implications of Professor Moore's work from a Black diasporic perspective, and what it means to kind of expand and connect different ideas about queer and lesbian sexuality kind of around Black communities around throughout the Americas. So for anyone who has studied or is familiar with the history of the Black family, that person will understand how fraught this institution has historically been, and will also understand not only the ways in which racial and sexual violence and threats of violence have long been central constitutive elements of the notion of family, in a sense always constituting the unspoken but ever-present family member. And we'll finally understand the ways in which the broken or the ruptured Black family has long been central to the enumeration of Black pathology, and how Black motherhood in particular has historically been viewed, particularly by white intellectuals and state institutions, as the source and the foundation of Black deviance, and particularly the notion of the overbearing and excessive enactments of Black womanhood that consistently weaken the family structure, i.e. kind of the Moynihan Report logic, emasculating Black men and so forth. But those who are familiar with this history will also know that alternative Black scholarship and Black feminist theory in particular has long underscored the creative, expansive, and imaginative ways that Black people have understood, articulated, and formed family. From Patricia Hill Collins' famous notion of other mothering, in which women who may be but are often not biologically related, nurture, care for, mentor, and instruct other Black women and indeed Black communities at large, to more recent scholarship on everything from creative naming practices, queer definitions of family and kinship, and so forth. Black intellectuals, artists, and activists have called attention to the ways in which Black people form bonds with one another in ways so that both in spite of, because of, and as a direct challenge to the racial terror and systemic disenfranchisement of slavery and racial apartheid, in spite of, in the words of noted geographer Ruthie Gilmore, the premature exposure to death, both literal and figurative, produced by mass incarceration, the violences of the urban ghetto, and the dismantling of the welfare state under neoliberalism, and also in spite of and because of the kind of popularly circulated image of the normative family, right, that takes on these very clear, it's always a nuclear family, it's very patriarchal, white heteronormative, et cetera, that have dominated kind of our visual and literary landscape for centuries. So to bring all this more specifically back to Mignon Moore's work, this book offers a profoundly transformative shift in the way that we understand these historical paradigms by centering lived experiences, histories, social identities, and parenting practices of Black lesbians. This book reminds us that Black lesbians continue to extend and make visible the powerful forms of Black sociality that have long been at the center of the way that Black family is constructed, but also allows us to see, to continue thinking about the ways in which Black women and Black lesbian women in particular are continually rethinking and reformulating and reshaping these kinds of the bonds of the intimate, the familiar, and the familial. And finally, and this is something that I was interested in thinking about with your work, even though I know this isn't explicitly where you were thinking about your analysis, but or maybe it was, but I'm really interested in the particular ways in which Black lesbian communities highlight the possibilities of the intimate and the familial spheres as sites of freedom, as sites of possibility, as sites of continued negotiation and redefinition, and ultimately as sites of transformative Black subjectivity. And so I'm thinking here of, I actually taught part of your book in my graduate class seminar this past fall, and we had actually read it right after, right after we had read Robin Kelly's piece about infrapolitics and kind of like the ways in which everyday people confront and critique structures of power. And it occurred to me that your book is actually a really beautiful and powerful example, but an unexpected example actually of what scholars like Robin Kelly have described as the hidden transcript, which for those of you who probably are for the most part familiar, but the idea that there's the way that James Scott puts it, is it's a critique of power that goes on off stage, so to speak, which power holders do not necessarily see or hear. And then which, what Kelly brings in is a particular analysis of Black Southern working class politics, and trying to get us to think about what are all of the ways that a dissident political culture can manifest itself in a range of different practices, but specifically in a way that is sort of hidden in plain sight. So that's something I'll just return to in a moment. So that's one point of interest is to what extent and how productive is it for us to think about the women and the families and experiences that you're describing as actually offering a new language for thinking about the political. So I'm trying to be mindful of time. So I'm reminded of a couple of things. Again, just thinking about how these women are consciously and unconsciously, intentionally and unintentionally redefining the way that we think of home, right? And if we come back to somebody like Barbara Smith, who in her famous anthology Home Girls, thinking about the place of intimacy and familiarity that's captured in the idea of home, right? And the particular reason why she uses that language as a Black feminist, Black lesbian feminist in particular. I'm also reminded of my talented colleague, Taryn Williamson, who currently teaches at Michigan State University and who writes, quote, in her dissertation, "Home for me is that sacred place where Black women and the people who love them completely gather periodically to laugh without restraint, to cry without fear of vulnerability, to vent their frustrations openly, and freely express the wholeness of their lives without first arming themselves for anticipated retaliation. But home is also not is not disconnected from its own conditions of possibility, and I'm therefore interested in exploring what are the ruptures and the fractures of home, what are the potentials for home to in fact be a home space, and how do, and this is my kind of ad-libbing, but also at what moments and through what bodies do we, as a Black community, then come to interpret sort of a threat or a menace to that idea of home and family. So I think I just have a couple of minutes left. So there was a few things that I wanted to just highlight, and maybe we could continue to talk about. So one of the things that I was really, there was a number of things that I was really impressed by and excited about. I heard another scholar describe, use this term, and I think it really fits your work, a really breathless methodology. I mean, it's really exquisite in some ways. Just
I'm gonna write that down. What? A breathless?
It leaves you breathless. So, and again, for me, thinking about, a historian who works on political movements, works on, slave resistance and all these kinds of things, it just made me think about the work that you're doing in terms of really, like you were saying, what's necessary to be able to capture the stories of women who have traditionally been absent, invisible, marginalized, et cetera, in the literature. And it just, and it strikes me that that is a really, is really potent on a number of different levels. Let me just get to what I'm planning on saying before I lose my time. Okay, so in terms of thinking about what does it mean to capture and what does it mean to tell the stories of this Black lesbian community and their stories of motherhood and parenting, I was really appreciating the way in which you were continually complicating the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality, and class, and nation, and religion, and also asking us to think about the fact that Blackness itself is inherently, it has to be a very expansive construct, right? And so and I've seen other stories where the Caribbean or Latin American backgrounds of their participants are just kind of, sort of folded into the story as opposed to constituting a story unto themselves. So I was thinking about, should you decide to kind of pursue this line of work even more, it might be interesting to think about some of the work that's coming out in the on queer and lesbian communities in the Caribbean. I'm thinking of like Jafari Allen's work, I'm thinking of Gloria Wecker's work, who in a lot of ways are very closely aligned to what you're doing. And I'm thinking that some of the identities and the perspectives and the experiences of the women who are eventually come to New York and become part of families there, even though so much of their narratives were about, the violence that they experienced and this really, really repressive environment in Jamaica, in Cuba, throughout the Caribbean, you also have, you also do in fact have these communities that, arguably thrive and flourish. And so so one of the things that Jafari Allen talks about is he's trying to reclaim the idea of friendship, and talking about that, he calls it like a mode of survival. So particularly when you have settings where to be out means the possibilities, I guess, for being out, right, particularly as a Black person, means something very different, right, in the global South oftentimes. And so the point that I'm making is that a lot of times that can foreclose some of the deeper discussions about how it is that people's sexual identities are actually very deeply being shaped, profoundly being shaped, in this instance, even before, they come to the U.S. So that might be something that would be really interesting to kind of follow the through line. And so if we have time, I can talk more about that later, but since I'm out of time, I've gotten the 1 minute card. The last thing that I will say, there's many things, see, I have all these pages of things that I was gonna say, but the last thing that I will say is, I'm really fascinated by the way, there's a really, to me, there's a really compelling and there's a really beautiful tension in a way that comes throughout the book, which is that there's the Black lesbian family is familiar and yet it's unfamiliar, it's visible yet it's invisible, and so what that leads me to ask is, what is it that has been named or unnamed in Black social discourse that allows these women to be so recognizable and yet so unrecognizable, so kind of externalized at the same time? And how does this actually draw our attention to the ways in which, to the moments in which sexuality and gender become social categories that have to be quote unquote contended with, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I fear I'm going to be a bit more prosaic than that and a little reedy, because otherwise I'll go over time. I don't often read books cover to cover these days because I have a toddler, but given this occasion, I gave myself permission to do that, and it was like every night after I put my toddler to bed, I'd get in bed with your book and a bowl of ice cream, and it was something really delicious. So now I associate your book actually with the evening and with relaxation, and so even looking at the cover makes me feel relaxed. So the book, as Mignon states at the outset in the introduction, is written, if I understood correctly, to illuminate the complexities of Black lesbian lives, which have been invisible at multiple registers, not only within Black social life or within the mainstream gay and lesbian movement, but also within scholarship on race, on gender, on sexuality, on families, all of the literatures that are precisely the literatures we would expect to have explored the kinds of families we get to know in this book. And I think that, the book makes so many wonderful contributions, but for me, what was really the standout great contribution of the book was the deep, deep ethnographic method, and it was such a stellar example of that. On the one hand, ethnographies are not uncommon in sociology, which is Mignon's discipline, and mine too. But few, if any, I think maybe none, have focused on lesbian subjectivity. But on the other hand, queer studies, from which we might expect volumes of research on lesbian subjectivity to emerge, has had very much a white male focus and has also largely become the terrain of the humanities. Mm-hmm. So what this means is that empirical research on lesbians of color and Black lesbians specifically is strikingly rare. So this book just flat out fills such an important void just at that empirical level. So what I find most exciting then about Invisible Families is that for me it reminded me of the kind of knowledge that is possible, the kind of knowledge that is gained when we do not cede queer studies to the humanities. And when we instead look systematically at lives that do not fall neatly into the dominant narrative about being lesbian or gay. So what kind of knowledge is gained in a sociological study of Black lesbians and their families and communities? Often scholars interested in doing intersectional work look at race, gender, and sexuality and their intersections and presume that we have captured the most influential, structural, and interactive forces in people's lives. But here, Mignon takes up a method that in some ways is so complex, I don't really think it quite has a name yet, or at least not a name that's in wide circulation. We might call it deep intersectionality, to borrow on the phrase deep ethnography, which is the work of uncovering culturally and structurally significant differences among a population that is often presumed to be so narrow and culturally insular as to be fairly homogeneous. The central thread of the book is that while Black lesbians share race, gender, and sexual subjectivities, their lives are profoundly shaped by other less visible dimensions of selfhood that vary among them, namely differences of ethnicity, socioeconomic class, motherhood status, gender performance, and country of origin or immigration status. The book is so rich, and there are countless examples of this deep intersectional method. So I'll just point to a few sites of intersection that receive such careful attention in the book and that really stood out for me. First, we learn how socioeconomic class shapes the very ways that race and sexuality intersect. The women Mignon interviewed made clear that their varied class statuses both amplify and mitigate, in some really rich and unpredictable ways often, their sense of the degree to which being a gay woman will violate Black cultural norms. In most cases, when middle-class respectability is achieved or seems achievable, this raises the stakes for Black lesbians as they make decisions about gender expression and public sexual persona, decisions they know will affect their families, their communities, and their job prospects. Women like Lynn and Angie, whose voices we hear in the book, explain that the desire to not add sexual scrutiny to racial scrutiny was especially important given that they were experiencing upward socioeconomic mobility. So the interviews also suggest that Black lesbians in professional occupations are more likely than those in working class occupations to reject female masculinity and lesbian roles or identity labels, and they are also less likely to be openly gay in their workplaces. And in each of these cases, Mignon skillfully sets up the historical and structural context here, from the exclusion of Black women from the cult of female virtue to the longstanding significance of middle-class respectability and responsible motherhood for Black women. We are reminded that the violation of gender and sexual norms never takes place outside of a racist and racialized past and present. I also love the book's attention to gender performance as its own unit of analysis. Women like Zoe suggest that Black femaleness, Zoe is another woman that Mignon interviewed for the book, and she suggests that Black femaleness already is marked by an exclusion from the dominant image of girlhood in the United States, which is exemplified by, she talks about, Barbie's white femininity, and that this exclusion informs how Black lesbians will understand any feelings of gender dysphoria or disidentification with idealized femininity that they may have. In the dominant white narrative about lesbian identity, female masculinity is presumed to stem entirely from one's gender or sexual subjectivity. But here we are offered expanded possibilities for theorizing gender transgression as a kind of disidentification that emerges from racial subjectivity as much as from essential gender or sexuality. Another wonderful highlight in the book is the way Mignon captures precisely when and how Black women first experience desire for other women, whether it's early in life, later in life, whether they relate to it as chosen or an essential part of who they are, and how even these presumably personal or idiosyncratic aspects of their life narratives are actually influenced by structural forces. So class, again, figures in here prominently, and the structural conditions of these women's adolescence in many cases determined when or how it was possible to even think about same-sex desire or about taking on some kind of public lesbian identity. And Mignon so clearly demonstrates that the particular paths Black women follow into a lesbian life set in motion a variety of other effects, including how women think about, like I said, sexuality as chosen or essential, how they perform their gender identity, whether they have children before or after coming out, the extent to which they involve their children in public gay life, and so forth. So these factors, such as the circumstances under which one has children, for instance, in turn shape women's chances of economic mobility. It's a very complex analysis. You almost need, I found myself wanting to kind of like make flowcharts or something, but what it made me realize is that that's precisely the kind of complexity that we need to not be afraid of, because that's the complexity that is our lives. So, for instance, when for women who had children later in life after coming out as lesbians in their younger adulthood, these women were more likely to hold higher status jobs. So here's a linkage that is rarely made visible that comes through in the book. So again, we see the reciprocal relationship between socioeconomic class, the structure of women's sexual lives, and women's identifications. The chapters on motherhood and division of labor also offer fascinating and incisive challenges to the dominant narrative about lesbian parenting and partnership. Many Black lesbians, as the book makes very clear, have children before identifying as lesbians, and often in the context of heterosexual partnerships. And I understand from research done by some of the fellows at the Williams Institute that this is also true for Latina and Native lesbians in Los Angeles. And this finding really poses a crucial challenge to the perception that I often hear this from my students, that white lesbians, given their economic resources and their access to adoption and reproductive technologies, are more likely to have children than lesbians of color, or that having children is something that they associate with privilege for same-sex couples. But as Mignon points out, this is the kind of logical error that is made when one defines lesbian parenthood very, very narrowly as giving birth while in a lesbian relationship. And if we open up what we're looking for, how we conceptualize what it means to be a lesbian mother, then there's entirely a different understanding of who's doing it and what it looks like. So I love this book, so I don't have much by way of critique, but in terms of questions that remain or possible topics for discussion, I did have a couple of things I wanted to point out. One is that I wondered about the typologies in the book, of which there are a few. The research subjects are classified as straight-up gay, conformists, hetero-identified lesbians, and sexually fluid. They're described as femmes, gender blenders, and transgressives. It was part of the fun of the book, frankly. It was like I got excited about reading the next category, like a little bit like horoscopes. But perhaps with the exception of femme, I didn't get the sense that these were the exact terms used by the women themselves. There wasn't any interview expert that said, well, I'm a gender blender, for instance. And some of these terms arguably hold some negative connotation, or they do for me, if no one else, like conform. I think if someone said, I've interviewed you and I've decided you're a conformist lesbian, I would probably be, I would argue back. Or if they told me I was hetero-identified. Though when I looked for myself, I most clearly fit into the conformist category, which was a little alarming. This brought up for me some questions about the value, I guess, of classificatory systems like this, which can be so useful as a way to condense and organize information for a scholarly audience, but also risk, if they're not handled carefully, which they are in this book, but I guess I'm worried about readers of the book, taking this in a reductive direction, or thinking that this is now the formula for how you would understand all lesbians should fit into one of these categories. So I don't know if we want to reflect on that. And the last thing is that the book also makes the point that a really important point, that 1970s white lesbian feminists very much rejected overt stud femme or butch femme gender expressions, and that because Black lesbians were excluded from the lesbian feminist movement of that time period, that dictate towards gender neutrality or rejection of stud femme frameworks had very little effect on black lesbians, and hence masculinity and femininity still have a lot of currency in black lesbian lives. And I suppose my question is about why privilege the 1970s here. And I gather it's because of the age group of the people you were interviewing, that maybe the 1970s was a formative period in their, or at least reference point in their coming out. But I ask this because, to my mind, there's been a resurgence of butch femme or stud femme, and there was in the 80s and 90s, and I think along with it a clarity that butch femme and stud femme are not only compatible with feminism, but are also feminist challenges to the notion that men alone can only be the ones to possess masculinity or to protect women in communities or to have sexual power and so forth. And I promised my students, because we read your book, that I would bring this question, because for some of them, I think their feminist identity, and I'm mostly, the students who mostly commented on this were not black lesbians, but Latina lesbians at UCR, but for them, they said, I feel like my feminist identity resonates very nicely with my femme or my butch identity. And so I guess the question is, had you interviewed people in their 20s today, do you think that element of the study might have had a different finding? So I'll wrap up there. Loved the book, have been very excited to teach it, and highly recommend, if there are teachers in the audience, teaching it, and also using it as a model, a methodological model, and a theoretical model. I know it will be that for me.
Thank you.
Well, I'll start by saying I too love this book, and so we definitely stacked the panel with people who were excited about reading this book. I cannot say that I ate it with ice cream. Mignon and I used to share a personal trainer, and Chris Baldwin would thrash our booty if she knew that we were reading chapters and eating ice cream every day. And so at least I know she thrashed mine. I don't know about yours, but in any case, I do want to thank Delena for bringing us together, and to Mignon for writing such an amazing book about black lesbian motherhood. I can understand now kind of why the three of us are asked to comment, because we really do come at it from slightly different yet similar kinds of perspectives. And I want to situate my comments. I'm a political scientist and a gender studies scholar, but I'm going to situate them as those of an intersectionality theorist and a black feminist theorist. And I say those two things because they are not identical roles. There actually is some distinction between being an intersectionality theorist and a black feminist theorist. And I want to give what I think are some important contributions Mignon makes, and again, you'll hear some echoes of what's been said, so I'll try and talk through those quickly so we don't, kind of dwell, even though we can dwell on how wonderful it is. And then I want to wrap up with a few questions for us to chew on as we move towards a discussion of what I think is a really important kind of focus, which is where do we go from here, right? So this is a seminal contribution. This is a shot across the bow, a throwing down of the gauntlet, whatever metaphor you'd like to use. But certainly we can't just rest here either, right? There's still so much to learn. There's still so much to keep thinking about, as we just heard. And so Moore's book, as you've heard, offers a wealth of data and careful interpretations of empirical evidence to make several landmark claims. And I want to focus my comments on what I see as a two-tiered kind of central argument here that I think is important. First and foremost, that race and class influence both how black women themselves understand their sexuality and parental roles, and how they live them on a daily basis. And so I think that's the first part of the central argument. And then the second part of the argument, which I think you just touched on a little bit, that I'd like to expand on, is that an intersectional analysis that variously incorporates race, class, sexuality, immigrant background, and gender complicates the standard research story that's told about lesbian families. And I think these sets of claims clearly establish Moore's work as part, and I would say a seminal part, of a long trajectory of intersectionality research. In Kimberly Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins landmark article, she identified 3 broad domains where intersectional analysis provides greater clarity. And she was really talking about content domains, right? So her idea of structural intersectionality focusing on contextual factors, right, that lead to immigrants' women's inability to avail themselves of legal protections around domestic violence, or her sense of political intersectionality, which I think does speak directly to Mignon's argument that there are these archetypes, and for lesbian families, it's white middle-class lesbian families are the archetypes, right? And you miss so much by just focusing on the archetype or the prototype. And so I think the third, of course, that Crenshaw talked about was this representational intersectionality and the cultural constructions of women of color. And I think these domains that she identified back in 1991 share 2 important insights that are relevant to the book that we're discussing today. Crenshaw's argument clearly sought to make the invisible visible. And so from the title to the very last page of the index, we are seeing part of what Crenshaw originally envisioned almost 30 years ago now, really coming to life here. And so I think it's not just an important contribution to the sociology work, to queer studies, to African American studies, to I already said sociology, I'll say it again, but also to where we see ourselves in terms of intersectionality scholarship, right? And so I think that that's very much a landmark achievement here. And that it was made after years of intense fieldwork and even more intense engagement with the products of such fieldwork is simply amazing. Without belaboring that, I feel like if this were the only contribution of the book, Moore would deserve to win multiple awards just for that alone. But luckily for us, it's only the first of many contributions. I think the second insight of Crenshaw's landmark work that your book clearly embodies, Mignon, is that intersectional analysis is in fact an analytical framework. And here's where I push back against Patricia Hill Collins, and I push back against some other folks who want to limit it solely as a concept, solely as an insight. It's a framework, right? And what do I mean by that? In other words, Crenshaw is arguing that it is looking to the intersection. So it's not the fact of the intersection itself, it's the looking to the intersections that gains us some amount of critical insight, that reveals something critical for us as a people, for us as a body politic, and not simply the intersection as a social fact that matters. So in other words, to go more empirical, because I am a social scientist, it is not simply a race variable plus a gender variable plus an interaction term, as so many people seek to kind of operationalize intersectionality. Instead, I would contend, and I think Crenshaw might agree, we could ask her across the quad, intersectionality is a justice-oriented analytical framework that allows us to understand the challenges for social justice much more clearly. And in this sense, I actually want to say that there is a name for the method that's put forth here. This is an excellent example of what I have elsewhere called paradigm intersectionality empirical research. So unlike structural, political, or representational intersectionality, paradigm intersectionality does not locate a particular domain, but instead provides a useful way to empirically operationalize intersectionality. It sets empirical standards for conducting research, and so I do agree that this is a model of how to do paradigm intersectionality. So often when I talk about paradigm intersectionality, that folks are like, but it's so hard, there's so much. And now I actually have a concrete example and say, well, if Mignon could do it, I have no doubt that you too will be able to do it about the questions that you would like to answer. Because it really does kind of set out what I think are a standard of research for doing intersectional work. How do I mean this? What I mean is that paradigm intersectionality has the potential to transform our world, and I think Mignon's work is an example of this in 3 critical ways. As Kathy Cohen, one of her predecessors, would say, and she cites Kathy in the book, as well as Elizabeth Cole, it allows us to identify unlikely or counterintuitive allies, right? So Kathy Cohen's insightful article in GLQ, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, talks specifically about how without a heteronormative analysis in an intersectional way, you don't get to see that welfare queens and punks and bulldaggers might actually have these common political projects, about being a non-normative kind of family. So I think that's an important insight. I think also it offers an alternative to the many activists, and this is particularly a contribution I think is important for African American studies and ethnic studies more generally. Many activists worry about destroying coalitions that are mobilized around a single axis of difference. This is what Kathy is talking about in her Boundaries of Blackness, that the black agenda can't possibly support something that's as inclusive as being attentive in 1999. She was talking about attentive to anti-HIV and HIV prevention kinds of strategies. And then I think the third thing that really speaks to what Mignon is talking about here is paradigm intersectionality allows us to offer a policy-oriented advantage, right? And by that I specifically mean it allows us to meaningfully analyze complex causality. And so in other words, what you start to see here is that even though there are intersections in terms of these women share a common race identification, a common gender identification in terms of their black, female, and a common sexual orientation, that they all identified as lesbian. They didn't identify as bisexual. They didn't identify as transgender. Lesbian was the common identity. That at the same time as that intersection is the same, there's this diversity within, right? So that there's this complexity, meaning that there are multiple causal paths to the same outcome. Get what I'm saying? So in other words, it's not just that there's a single magic bullet to designing how same-sex marriage would function or designing how adoption laws might work, that there might be multiple paths that Mignon really illuminates in terms of how the women actually arrive at motherhood, right? And so, again, I want to walk through this just so I can kind of distinguish what I'm talking about and what I see in Mignon's book from what I would call a thin operationalization of intersectionality. In terms of the first dimension, categorical multiplicity, Mignon works through a variety of categories of difference as dynamic processual elements, right? So it's not that race is static so that someone identifies as black and it means the same thing at 17 to them as it means at 24, as it means at 54 to them. It's a dynamic processual kind of analysis of race as a category, of gender as a category, of sexual orientation. The whole, I just love the chapter of coming into the life, and really distinguishing what that expression means versus the standard coming out story that we hear about so much, in all of the it's so weird to call, mainstream LGBT literature, right? So for so long, so much of what we did was not ever mainstream, but there's now this mainstream queer theory out there that is humanities oriented, I would say. And so the fact that she's able to do that with multiple categories, so she does that with race, she does that with sexuality, she does that with class and national status. She has a nuanced understanding and fluency in the literature in all of these categories, which is just simply outstanding. Second dimension, intersections, I've already mentioned. These are the things that they as self-identified blacks, lesbians share in common, right? So if you're thinking about a policy, these kinds of things might be something that we can think about as forming a political agenda around. But unlike other previous intersectionality scholars, usually what happens is that they focus on either what everybody has in common or what they have as different, right? So that it's an either-or kind of approach. We're either trying to prove how different they are or we're trying to prove how similar they are. And what Mignon does instead in this book is say, no, that it's both and. That they have these commonalities, absolutely, but there are these important systematic kinds of variation, to use more empirical kinds of terms, that really does matter, right? So we can collect folks around coming into the life stories, and that there are some commonalities there, but there's also important kind of diversity that makes some of those taxonomies that she develops quite useful. Last but certainly not least, I want to talk about the final dimension, and that's the focus on individual institutional relationships. And there wasn't as much of this in the first 2/3 of the book, but again, Jackie's story of how she came to adopt her son Andrew and navigated the Children and Family Services, and her chapter on religious engagement in the later part of the book really gets us to see how important it is from an intersectionality perspective to not just think of individuals as isolated people who are separate from one another. They're embedded in families, they're embedded in communities, they're embedded in churches, they're embedded in political sets of institutions and arrangements that are really important. Now that said, this is one of the ways in which, I think we could have had a little bit more, so I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. And so with all of that in mind, I want to ask several questions that will hopefully push us towards this conversation. And so building on that idea of the individual institutional relationships part of paradigm intersectionality, I think there is a pushing in most of the book against lesbian feminism, but then towards the end of the book there's a turning towards black feminism. And so I wanted to hear, and maybe we could have a discussion about, there's an interesting relationship with political ideologies here and the ways in which they ebb and flow that I think has important kinds of ramifications for any kind of activism, for example, that could emerge from these identities, right? So we think of identities as people build group consciousness around identities. They get a sense of linked fate, that there are other folks who are going through the same thing, and that's what builds a social movement. That's what builds folks, mobilizing on the steps of the Capitol, or, writing their congresspeople, or whatever it is. Second question, I so appreciated bringing in of immigrant background as a category of difference that's meaningful to women's lives. And I just wanted to see if there was more here worth talking about in terms of were there mixed partnerships between West Indian and African American women. You mentioned, I think, one that was African American and Puerto Rican, that might be interesting, that didn't make it into the book. Third, I was really struck by the questions that illustrated the fluidity of identity and the tension when you asked questions like which identity is more salient. And I was actually reminded of Edwina Barbosa's work, Wealth of Selves, where she actually uses Gloria Anzaldúa and Maria Lugones. And so I wondered, just kind of following along the lines of our previous commenters, not so much is there a difference between black lesbians and white lesbians, but what about Latina lesbians? What about other women of color lesbians? Are there maybe some continuities that we could think about that could build out this movement a little bit more broadly if we were in fact trying to create a social movement? Two final questions. I really want us and hope we can have an honest and open conversation that kind of takes what was said by one of the first comments and turns it on its ears. The assumptions of the liberatory potential of so-called alternative models of motherhood, parenting, sexuality, etc. I think that we do make a lot of assumptions because it's alternative that it can quite possibly be liberatory, but you're very clear and lucid about the politics of respectability as well, operating. And so there's this tension between wanting to be a good mother and, even though women are expressing themselves alternatively in terms of sexuality and in terms of motherhood and in terms of sharing of labor, there are also some things that are very much kind of the standard mainstream story, right? So even though they say they believe in, equal sharing of labor, it's clear that one woman is still doing most of the work. And oh yeah, she happens to be the biological mother, and so what do we do with the fact that there's, both a reification of some of the politics of respectability, even as there are challenges. And then last but not least, I just had a point of information question about the photos. In the book. There are all these wonderful photos in the book of families, and you're so clear about using women's full names wherever possible, and the photos were unidentified. And so I didn't know, I wanted to see if there was a picture of Jackie, and her son Andrew, but I have no idea whether the pictures of mothers and sons that are in the book, if there's a Jackie and Andrew picture there, And so I just wondered what was going on about that. There might be an easy explanation, or maybe a decision about, that we could explore about the public performativity of one's roles and identities. So thank you.
Wow. I want to give everyone a hand. I thought that was great. Okay, well, so I don't know how many of you have ever written a book or you've written an article, and then you have people come and talk about it, or people write about it and review it and critique it. So this is an interesting experience, from sitting here, having been the author of this and having put so much time and effort into an area that has a, it's a difficult area. It's not a safe area to write about. At least that's my experience with it. It's not safe to me. It's not conformist in the sense of how the Academy would imagine you to achieve success, right? It's not necessarily by writing about groups that are marginalized on many dimensions. Hosting this event, the Bunche Center, and I want to thank the scholars for taking the time to read it and to provide comments, because that they have their own work to think about, and so I do very much appreciate the time you've taken to discuss the work. So the goal of my work, it was really to, you have these different dimensions of the work. So one dimension is to call attention to this group that's understudied. But beyond that, I want to theorize race in the study of sexuality, and it's something that we haven't seen very much in the field of sexuality studies, and we haven't seen this kind of analysis of sexuality in African American studies. So I'm doing this through the lens of a sociologist, but we might also think about a political scientist doing this kind of work, a psychologist doing this kind of work, other areas. So I'm taking a specifically sociological approach. And I chose to study families. And I thought about other groups when I was in New York and first coming into an awareness of this community. I met older women in Harlem who owned these beautiful brownstones and had these parties, that went back into the 50s and 60s. And, so I could have focused on just the aged population. There were these kids who were hanging out on Chelsea Pier, very young LGBT youth, and so I could have focused on the youth, although I just couldn't see myself hanging out on the pier. I thought about working class women, black lesbians. So anyway, I saw these groups, and then what really stuck out to me was, because I'm a family sociologist perhaps, were the family lives of these groups. And so that's where I decided to draw my attention. But other people doing this work might think about other ethnic groups, might think about other geographic regions, right? People who may have a strong identity as a farmer, right? In rural areas, or as a Southerner, and how that might influence the ways they think about their sexuality. So when I think about the intended audience, I mean, I had to write the book. This was my book to get tenure, so I had to write it, with an academic focus. So some of it is, some of the folks who aren't so much into academia say, oh, the beginnings of these chapters, there's just so much of this. And I said, just skip past that and get to the stories, right? You can get to the stories if you want to read the stories. The stories are illuminating in and of themselves. But I did write it as an academic book. But my hope is that it will reach different groups. It will reach kind of regular people in different communities who may have a gay family member, activists who have a particular politics, and even I'm hoping my mother will read it, although I don't know if I want her to read it. I hope she reads it. She has it, she's very proud of it. She says, oh, my daughter wrote a book. I don't know if she actually read past the acknowledgments where I thank her. I just want to say a few things about some of the comments. Obviously, I can't address all of them. They did give me some food for thought, and I tried to write down some of the main points. And there is this tension throughout the book on that. It's interesting when you hear people talk about your work, right? They use their language, and you're like, yes, that is what I was saying. I didn't say it that way, but that is what I was saying. So this tension, that runs throughout, it is a real tension of, visibility and invisibility, and legitimacy and not being legitimate, and how the women kind of navigate that path. And what are the possibilities for transforming certain ideologies and beliefs, and then in what ways do they reify those or conform to them, and how does that relate to wanting to be part of, not to be excluded from the racial community. So for these women, they were largely born in the 1960s and 1970s. They came to understand themselves as black girls growing up in a particular time. So their parents were coming right out of these different social movements, and for their parents primarily civil rights and black power movements. So the way they understood themselves was navigated by race. And even if they themselves lived in a predominantly white area, others around them interacted with them based on race. So race was a category and an experience that had to be part of how they understood themselves, even before, this is my argument, even before they came to understand a particular sexuality. And so that has implications when you think about younger cohorts, right? Because now we talk much more openly about LGBT identities and same-sex marriage, and these things are on the table. And we see more general movement for some youth away from categories, away from racial categories, right? So you see this movement of having a multiracial identity as opposed to, you know, this one-drop rule that girls growing up in the 1960s and 70s, and boys too, would have been forced to accept. This also extends to sexuality, right? And so we talked about, Jane talked about the categories and how firmly, how I use them in the book. They're not meant to necessarily be categories that people take on as identity statuses, but just ways of understanding how people in the community think of themselves. So one example has to do with gender presentation, and I identified 3 different types of gender presentation in Black lesbian communities: femmes, what I call gender blenders, and then what I call transgressives. Well, yeah, there are some problems with these categories, and no matter what you call them across the country, there's still problems with all the categories outside of femme, and that has to do with you know, discomfort with being classified outside of kind of middle class norms. So I create this category called gender blender, mainly because it describes how the women look and how they perform their gender expression in relationships. But in New York, they might call those women femme aggressive. Out here, they might say soft stud or soft butch, or, you know, there are all kinds of words. So my categories were kind of meant to be a way for you to, a person looking in the community, to understand the characteristics of that group and not necessarily an identity status that they take on. The same way in coming into the life, I identify different pathways, different routes to how people come to accept a gay sexuality. And so one of the pathways is a conformist pathway, but I certainly don't mean that the people who took that path are conformist in the ways they understand their sexuality. So I do have to think about, I think that might be an issue others have, you know, people who kind of don't like classification systems. But I'm kind of pushing, I know. I told you when you touch those, it makes me nervous.
I just don't want it to fall.
You're not. When you, the women that I study have always been defined by categories. So it's hard to get away from categories in how they understand themselves, how society sees them, and then how they understand their sexuality. So for me, categories are useful because they help people see the different components. But I'm not advocating that people be confined to one particular category. You know, if you want to know about intersectionality, this woman here is the person to go to read all of her work. I didn't know much about this political scientist's work at the time that I was writing this. Had I read more of her work, I think that some of my frameworks would have been a little different. I do use her paradigm intersectionality. I don't call it that, but I find a nice synergy with the ways I'm thinking about it and the ways that she theorizes about it. In terms of the Caribbean-born women, I have about 25 interviews, and I'd love for someone to work with me on doing something with them. So I need someone who's interested, and I'm very interested, and there's a lot there that didn't make it into the book, but the idea of having to leave your family of origin or leave an area in order to more fully enact a gay sexuality is something that you see not just with the foreign-born women who were born in the Caribbean and Africa, but also you see this in, right here in different racial communities, and so there's a lot more that needs to be done in that area, and I'd love to work with someone on that. And the last thing I'll just say is has to do with the tension between the different feminisms in the book, and sometimes Kathy Cohen read an early draft and said I was just too hard on the lesbian feminism, lesbian feminists, and I didn't think I was too hard, but I did think more about what I was arguing and about black feminism and the context of these feminisms. So when you think about younger people today and how they're comfortable, as Jane said, with being femme and having a feminist identity, I'm developing some ideas right now about race and femininity and what it means for black women. And I have this presentation where I show Michelle Obama as this woman who can be feminine in her gender presentation and not be threatened. Her credibility as a strong woman is not threatened. So I talk about black communities and what femininity means in them historically. When you see someone who's dressed and she has on heels and lipstick, this person looks like a successful person. This person looks like an independent person, as a person who's strong. It doesn't have the same connotations, the same stereotypes of femininity as being frail or submissive or weak. And so I think that offers a space for women of color to embrace this kind of feminine identity and not have it be associated with weakness. And so I'm working on these ideas more generally, not just for lesbian communities, but more generally, that we need to understand some of these feminist frameworks or categories and how they relate to other groups. And so in the book, the names in the book are pseudonyms. And so I didn't want to have names under the photos because either I'd have a name under the photo that was a pseudonym, and then people who knew the couple or the person would now know that that was this person's life. Right? Because so if I tell you that this is, and I can tell you this couple, only sometimes I can't even remember their real names anymore. But this couple, I'm so sorry, I can't think of their names. But anyway, they wouldn't mind if I tell you their names. They're in, I feel so bad, I can't think of their names. Anyway, you wouldn't care, you don't know them anyway. So anyway, so I wouldn't, I didn't feel comfortable putting their real names on the photos, because then you'd know that they were in the book, and I didn't feel comfortable putting the pseudonyms because then you'd figure out their stories, and and I promised them confidentiality. So that was how. But they did want to all be in the book, and they were excited to have their photos in the book. So I think that's interesting. Anyway, I appreciate you all, and I appreciate you. So thank you.
Okay, so we're running a little bit behind on time, so I just want to change just the format of the discussion a little bit. So I was taking notes, so I'm going to read my notes so you guys can remember a little bit what each of the respondents spoke about. And since Mignon is last, I think the whatever the cognitive effect is that you guys will remember what she said more clearly. Okay, and then what we'll do is I'll let you guys kind of get a plate of snacks, and we'll put the chairs in a circle and talk that way. Does that sound good for everyone? Okay. So Aisha went first, and she started with an anecdote about going to the DMV, which I thought was very important, because I think that's what this work should do, is allow people to speak about these issues of invisibility. So then she offered a historical contextualization and also the implications from a diasporic perspective. And then she talked about how Black family has been a fraught institution. And she talked about the women's, the cult of true femininity. a little bit, and then she talked about issues of violence in the Black family, broken families, pathologizing Black women, Black motherhood, and Black families. And she talked about how Black lesbians extend and make visual Black women's bonds and bonds within the community. And she also talks about how discussing Black lesbians gives us a sense of the possibility of freedom or the transformative nature. And she mentioned the hidden transcript. I think that's Kelly. Talked about the hidden transcript and discussions that happen off of stage outside of the view of the power holders. And then she mentioned the Homegirls book, whose author, I never remember her name, Barbara Smith. And then she also talked about Robinson, who speaks about home as a safe space for Black women, but also how there's a rupture within the home. Sometimes it's not safe. She talks about the breathless methodology that's necessary to allow Black women to speak, and how Blackness is expansive. And she talks about this issue of reclaiming friendship as a mode of survival, especially for like people who are out, and that comes from Jafari Allen. And then Jane began by talking about the multiple literatures that Mignon talks about in her book. Not only is she allowing her subjects to speak for themselves, but she's also contextualizing them within these different literatures that happen in sociology. And so she talks about the standout for her was this deep ethnographic method that LGP studies focuses on white, male, and it very much comes from a humanities perspective. And that this deep ethnographic method allows Mignon's study to be more empirical. And it also allows a deep intersectionality that highlights different salient aspects of identity, such as class, and gayness disrupts a middle class identity. And she also talks about disidentification in terms of gender presentations. And she also talks about that this empirical nature, I guess, encourages sociologists and researchers not to be afraid of complexity. And some of the questions that Jane spoke about were typologies, that the typologies could kind of reify a lot of the categories that we put people in. And she also asked us to question the difference between 1970s gender roles and gender roles of today, whereas we might see them as being heteronormative versus then it was a little different. Okay, and then Ange Marie was really intense. So she's coming from it from an intersectionality and gender studies theorist position. And she talks about how it's a seminal work because there's a wealth of data in the work. And she offers a two-tiered, she says that Mignon's book is a two-tiered argument focusing on race and class and its influence on gender, sex roles, and lived experience. And also how intersectionality complicates the story a great deal. And then she talks about Moore's book within the frame of Kimberly Crenshaw's 1991 article. I didn't catch the title though.
Mapping the margins. Mapping the margins.
Mapping the margins. Okay, I'm gonna write that down. And she talks about 3 domains, 2 of which I got were archetypal and representational domains, and talks about how important it is to make the invisible visible, and how intersectional analysis is a framework for allowing that to happen. And then she goes on to talk about paradigm intersectionality, and that Moore's book is an example of this, and it allows 3 things to happen. And this is, I think, is coming from Kathy Cohen and Simon Cole, that helps people identify unlikely allies, allows coalition building across groups, and also allows for this policy-oriented advantage. And she talks about complex causality. And I have a little bit more, but I want to let you guys have a chance to eat. So you guys can get some things, and we'll start just rearranging the chairs a little bit. So I'll have you guys come to the front and sit in the front.
Okay.
So I have one of these coming up in August, so.
Oh, you do?
You'll have to tell me, like, after a week or so, like, how does it feel? Because it's super intense, you know?
Yes, yes.
I mean, even if it's, like, friendly, you know it's not going to be,
very supportive. It's interesting to hear it. What did he say?
To take a picture of the 4 of us in the hallway.